On the evening of April 10, 1932, the corridors of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin were unusually quiet. Outside, the city hummed with election night tension. Across Germany, polling stations had just closed in the presidential runoff. In countless beer halls and back rooms, people leaned toward radios to hear whether the aging Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg or the firebrand agitator Adolf Hitler would become head of state. Inside the Chancellery, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning waited for the first reliable figures. He was 56, spare and severe, a devout Catholic from the Center Party who dressed and behaved more like a schoolmaster than a politician. For 2 years he had ruled Weimar Germany not by parliamentary majorities, which he had never truly possessed, but by presidential emergency decrees signed by Hindenburg under Article 48 of the Constitution. Brüning believed he was buying time, holding the Republic together through crushing economic crisis and political extremism until the storm passed. If Hitler won tonight, there would be no more time to buy. Early returns flickered in from Prussia, the Rhineland, Saxony. The pattern was clear even before the final count. Hindenburg had increased his margin from the first round. When the official figures were confirmed, they showed the incumbent winning with roughly 53% of the vote. Hitler had climbed to a disturbing 36%, Ernst Thälmann of the Communists held at around 10%. But the crucial fact was simple. The presidency remained in the hands of a man Brüning believed, or hoped, could be a bulwark against dictatorship. Across Germany, Nazi stormtroopers of the SA reacted very differently. Their candidate had lost, but he had brought more than 13 million voters behind him. Brownshirt columns had turned electioneering into near civil war. Street brawls with communists and police were now part of daily life. To many Germans, the ballot boxes tonight seemed less important than the fists and truncheons that would return to the streets tomorrow. Brüning and his ministers looked at those same streets and drew a drastic conclusion. If Hitler could not be kept from the presidency by votes alone, then his private army must be broken by law. On April 13, just 3 days after Hindenburg's re-election, the government issued an emergency decree banning the Sturmabteilung, SA, and the Schutzstaffel, SS, throughout the Reich. Uniforms, public marches, and activities of the Nazi paramilitaries were outlawed. The decree, signed by Hindenburg at Brüning's urging, was justified as a measure to restore public order. On paper, the move was bold and logical. Remove the Nazi street muscle, undercut their ability to intimidate opponents and disrupt meetings, stabilize the Republic. In reality, it landed like a shell in Germany's tangled web of power. The Reichswehr officer corps loathed the SA, but many conservative elites loathed the Republic more. To them, Brüning's ban looked like another step toward what they feared most, a social dictatorship propped up by trade unions and the Catholic Center, ruling by decree and threatening traditional property and privilege. Junker landowners east of the Elbe were already furious at Brüning's proposed agrarian reforms, which envisioned breaking up bankrupt estates to aid destitute farmers. Watching all this with cold, analytical eyes was General Kurt von Schleicher, the political mastermind within the Army High Command. For months, Schleicher had been cultivating an alternative vision of Germany's future, a presidential authoritarian regime resting on the army, nationalist conservatives, and, if necessary, tamed Nazis. Brüning's SA/SS ban directly threatened that project. It alienated the very right-wing forces Schleicher was courting and stiffened Hindenburg's suspicion that his chancellor was dragging the old field marshal into a fight with the traditional right. Hindenburg, 74, living as much at his Neudeck estate as in Berlin, disliked party politicians and distrusted mass movements, red or brown. He had never been emotionally close to Brüning. The Chancellor's stern austerity policies, imposed during the Great Depression, had deepened unemployment and hunger. Now Brüning asked him to sign decrees that enraged conservative landowners Hindenburg considered his natural base. The SA ban, intended to weaken Hitler, instead strengthened Schleicher's argument that Brüning was a liability. As April turned into May, the Chancellor believed he had scored a crucial victory by winning Hindenburg's re-election and striking at Nazi paramilitaries. Behind the scenes, in the smoke-thick rooms where uniforms and frock coats mingled, plans were already being laid to remove him. Within weeks, Brüning would discover that the authority he had wielded through Hindenburg's pen could be taken away by that same trembling signature, leaving Germany's course to be set by men who believed they could ride the tiger of Nazism without being devoured. The ban on the SA and SS did not empty Germany's streets overnight. It changed who believed they controlled them. Within days of the April decree, local police stations up and down the Reich were flooded with complaints, petitions, and legal maneuvers. Nazi lawyers challenged the ban in provincial courts. Gauleiters sent furious telegrams denouncing a red-black dictatorship of Social Democrats and Catholics. SA men simply swapped uniforms for plain clothes and kept meeting in back rooms. In Berlin, the cabinet watched nervously for the real test. Would the ban provoke a Nazi uprising? It did not. Hitler, still calculating his path to power, forbade any open revolt. He had just won 13 million votes in the presidential race. He would not risk the party's new electoral respectability on a street war he might lose. The SA grumbled, but they waited. To Brüning, this looked like proof that firm legal action could contain Nazism. To Kurt von Schleicher, it confirmed what he already believed: Hitler was disciplined enough to be negotiated with, and dangerous enough to be useful. Schleicher had long since stepped beyond the role of a conventional staff officer. As head of the Ministeramt in the Defense Ministry, he served as the central link between the army, the president, and political factions. He met privately with party bosses, industrialists, and Hindenburg's inner circle. In his notebooks and conversations he spoke of constructing a core front, a cross-front alliance of the army, conservative elites, and elements of the nationalist right that would bury parliamentary democracy for good. Brüning's austerity policies, meant to rescue Germany from hyperinflation's shadow and the Great Depression, played directly into Schleicher's hands. Unemployment hovered near 6 million. Emergency decrees cut wages and social spending. To the Chancellor, these were bitter medicines. To the unemployed in Berlin's working-class districts and the ruined farmers of East Prussia, they looked like abandonment. On the Junker estates east of the Elbe, another crisis simmered. Hindenburg's class, landed aristocrats whose fortunes rested on heavily indebted farms, leaned on the state for subsidies and East aid packages. Brüning, facing empty coffers, proposed something that struck at their pride as much as their wallets: large, insolvent estates would be broken up to relieve peasant misery. The General Staff might accept budget cuts, the Junkers would not accept land reform. Schleicher understood where to press. He cultivated Hindenburg's son, Oskar, and the President's State Secretary, Otto Meissner. In private conversations at Neudeck, the Hindenburg family estate in East Prussia, he painted Brüning as a man out of touch with the countryside, a Catholic parliamentarian trying to dismantle the very class Hindenburg came from. The Chancellor's ban on the SA and SS became, in these retellings, not a defense of order but a provocation to the nationalist right. The old field marshal, increasingly deaf and weary, listened. Brüning did not see the full danger. In the spring of 1932 he was preoccupied with two immense problems: stabilizing the economy and renegotiating Germany's reparations. Abroad, he had real successes. At the Lausanne conference that summer, his diplomacy would effectively end the hated reparations payments imposed at Versailles. At home, however, that achievement was overshadowed by breadlines, political violence, and the feeling among many elites that he was isolating Germany from its natural allies on the right. To hold his fragile coalition of Center Party, Social Democrats, and Republican conservatives together, Brüning increasingly relied on presidential decrees instead of Reichstag majorities. Each new decree deepened the paradox: the man fighting to preserve the Republic was governing it in ways that hollowed out its parliamentary core. By May, Schleicher judged the time ripe. He began quietly searching for a replacement chancellor, someone conservative enough to please Hindenburg and the Junkers, pliable enough to be guided by the army, yet outwardly respectable. He found him in an unlikely figure, Franz von Papen, a former Center Party politician, wealthy Catholic aristocrat, and political lightweight with almost no mass support. To most observers, Papen looked like a footnote. To Schleicher, he was a perfect instrument, reactionary, vain, and grateful. Meanwhile, the Reichstag seethed. In April, Brüning had managed to keep a tottering majority in place by emergency decree. But fresh elections loomed, and with them the near certainty that Nazis and communists would grow stronger, further gutting the center. Inside ministries and newspaper offices, talk turned from whether a change of government was coming to what form the inevitable presidential regime would take. On May 10, 1932, Brüning traveled to Newdick expecting to discuss agrarian reform and foreign policy with Hindenburg. Instead, he found a president chilled against him, armed with Schleicher's complaints and Junker grievances. Their conversation was formal, strained. Hindenburg spoke of unrest in the countryside, of disrespect for old Prussian traditions, of the need for a government enjoying the confidence of the nation. Brüning left Newdick still formally chancellor, but for the first time, he could sense that the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. The pen that had signed his decrees might soon sign his dismissal. Within 3 weeks, that quiet fear would become a blunt reality. Schleicher's maneuvering was about to bear fruit, and Germany's experiment with constitutional crisis management was about to be replaced by something far more unstable, a cabinet built on intrigue, presidential whim, and the dangerous illusion that Adolf Hitler could be controlled. The blow, when it came, was delivered with the formality of a military order. On May 29, 1932, Heinrich Brüning was summoned again to Newdick. The Chancellor had spent the previous weeks grappling with budget figures and agrarian legislation, still convinced that he could steer Germany through the Depression with emergency decrees and painful reforms. He knew his standing with President Hindenburg had been shaken, but not shattered. The SA ban, he believed, had demonstrated his will to defend order. His foreign policy successes, including the prospect of ending reparations, seemed to argue for continuity. At Newdick, the atmosphere told him otherwise. In the paneled study of the East Prussian estate, Hindenburg received him with icy courtesy. The old field marshal, flanked by his son Oscar and State Secretary Otto Meissner, spoke of unrest, of alienated landowners, of the need for a government that enjoyed broader confidence. The words bore Schleicher's fingerprints. The army general, though not present, had already briefed Hindenburg that Brüning's agrarian plans would Bolshevize the countryside and that the SA ban risked driving the nationalist right into open opposition to the presidency. There was no shouting, no thumping of tables. Hindenburg simply informed Brüning that his government no longer possessed his full confidence and that he expected the Chancellor's resignation. Brüning, constitutionally scrupulous to the end, complied. On May 30, 1932, he handed in his resignation in Berlin. The man who had ruled Germany for 2 turbulent years by presidential decree left office as quietly as he had entered it. Crowds did not gather, no votes were cast. The Republic's fate turned on a private conversation between an aging president and a general who believed parliamentary politics had run its course. Almost immediately, Hindenburg named Brüning's successor, Franz von Papen. To the public, the choice was baffling. Papen had been an obscure Center Party deputy, more known in Catholic circles and riding clubs than in the Reichstag. Within days his own party expelled him for joining an openly anti-parliamentary experiment. But to Schleicher, who had proposed him, Papen had the right profile, aristocratic bearing, conservative instincts, little independent political base, and a profound sense of having been called to save Germany. He would be, in effect, a front man for a presidential, military regime. The cabinet Papen assembled in early June confirmed that impression. Dominated by nobles and industrialists, it quickly earned the nickname Cabinet of Barons. Only 2 members had seats in the Reichstag, most owed their positions to contacts in the army, big business, or Hindenburg's social circle. Schleicher himself moved into the open as Reich Defense Minister, ensuring that the Reichswehr's interests sat at the very heart of government. Parliamentary arithmetic scarcely figured in their calculations. The Nazis and Communists together already held enough seats to block any stable majority. Papen's cabinet did not seek one. Instead, it aimed to govern, as Brüning had, via presidential decree, but now explicitly against the party system rather than an uneasy coexistence with it. Yet to secure its footing, the new regime needed one thing from the Reichstag, its own dissolution. On June 4, 1932, barely days after taking office, Papen persuaded Hindenburg to dissolve the parliament and call new elections for July 31. The move would, he hoped, weaken the Social Democrats and Center Party further, swell Nazi representation, and thus create the conditions for a presidential government propped up by the National Socialists from the outside, but not yet sharing real power. Central to that design was a dramatic reversal of Brüning's last major act. On June 16, Papen's government issued a new emergency decree lifting the ban on the SA and SS Nazi stormtroopers, who had chafed for 2 months under legal restraint, poured back into the streets. Uniforms reappeared in every city square. Marches resumed, flags unfurled, drums beat time to slogans shouted under torchlight. Papen and Schleicher told themselves, and Hindenburg, that this was a necessary concession. Better to bring Nazi violence back into the open, they argued, than to drive it underground. Better to make a gentleman's agreement with Hitler, winning his tolerance for the presidential regime, than to keep pushing him into outright opposition. The lifting of the ban, they believed, would buy Nazi goodwill and help marginalize the left. On the ground, it had a simpler effect. It made the streets more dangerous. Clashes between brownshirts and communists spiked. Weapons became more common, casualties rose. Police found themselves increasingly hesitant, torn between enforcing public order and knowing that their political masters had just rewarded the very men they were trying to restrain. In working-class districts and small towns alike, many Germans concluded that the state was no longer neutral, but leaning toward Hitler. Inside Nazi headquarters, the message was clear. Brüning, who had dared to outlaw them, was gone. A new chancellor, an aristocrat with no party of his own, now courted their favor and restored their right to march. Hitler, who only weeks earlier had been denied the presidency by the electorate, discovered that he could win strategic victories without winning elections at all. The Reichstag was dissolved. The SA and SS were back on the streets. A government with virtually no democratic legitimacy claimed to rule in the president's name, convinced it could juggle army interests, Junker demands, and Nazi ambitions. Germany was heading toward new elections and deeper crisis, steered by men who believed they could use Adolf Hitler as a tool. On July 20, 1932, the last strong pillar of democratic Germany was toppled with the stroke of a pen and the rumble of army trucks on Berlin's streets. That morning, commuters in the capital noticed something unusual along Unter den Linden and around the government quarter. Reichswehr soldiers stood guard where Prussian police normally patrolled. Armored cars rolled past the Brandenburg Gate. By noon, detachments of troops were occupying ministries and police headquarters, not in the name of the Weimar Republic, but under the authority of Chancellor Franz von Papen, acting as Reich Commissioner for Prussia. The pretext was restoration of order. In the weeks since Papen had lifted Brüning's ban on the SA and SS, political violence had surged. Street brawls between Nazis and communists left dozens dead, hundreds injured. On July 17, clashes in Altena near Hamburg, the Altenaer Blutsonntag, killed 18 people when police opened fire during an SA march that had turned into a running battle. Papen seized on the chaos. Claiming that the Social Democratic-led Prussian government had lost control and endangered internal security, he persuaded Hindenburg to sign yet another emergency decree under Article 48, the so-called Prussenschlag, the Prussian coup. Legally, the decree suspended the authority of the largest and most democratic state government in Germany. Practically, it allowed Papen to depose elected ministers in Prussia and place its vast police apparatus under his direct command. To Social Democrats, liberal jurists, and many ordinary Berliners, the meaning was stark. Overnight, the Republic's last major bastion, Prussia, with its disciplined civil service and Republican police force, had been turned into an instrument of a presidential cabinet that had no parliamentary majority and no mandate from voters. For Hitler and the Nazis, the change was a mixed blessing that still tilted in their favor. On one hand, they resented any show of force by the traditional right. SA men had long hated Prussian police as red stooges who broke up marches and raided party offices. Replacing those police with troops under Papen's authority did not immediately make life easier for them. On the other hand, the Prussenschlag confirmed something Hitler had sensed since Brüning's fall: the old elites were now dismantling democracy with their own hands, and they were doing it while treating him as a necessary partner. The coming Reichstag elections on July 31 would prove just how necessary. The campaign unfolded against a background of uniforms and flags. SA ranks, now fully legal again, marched by torchlight through city centers, singing of breaking Marxism and Versailles. Communist columns answered with their own red banners. Papen's cabinet of barons, with no real party machine, looked almost invisible beside the mass movements to its left and right. When the votes were counted, the center ground of Weimar lay in ruins. The Nazis soared to 37.3% of the vote, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag with 230 seats. The Communists gained as well, reaching nearly 15%. The once dominant Social Democrats and the bourgeois center and liberal parties shrank. No democratic coalition could be built without Nazi participation, and Hitler refused to offer it on anyone's terms but his own. Papen tried to bluff. He convened the new Reichstag on August 30th under heavy police and army presence, hoping that the aura of presidential authority would cow the parties into reluctant cooperation. Instead, the deputies delivered a resounding vote of no confidence in his cabinet, 512 against, only 42 in favor. Papen responded by asking Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag again and call yet another election for November. The cycle had become vicious. Each election made the Nazis stronger, the Communists bolder, and the middle weaker. Each dissolution deepened the sense that Parliament was useless. Each emergency decree from Hindenburg replaced law with personal rule. Looking back, the crucial turn still lay in the weeks when Brüning fell. By removing the one chancellor who combined some legitimacy with a genuine, if often clumsy, desire to preserve the constitutional order, Hindenburg and Schleicher had opened the door to cabinets like Papen's. Governments without parties, resting almost entirely on presidential favor and increasingly dependent on Hitler's tolerance. The lifting of the SA/SS ban gave the Nazi movement back its most potent weapon, the ability to dominate the streets. The Preußenschlag showed that the presidency would crush even loyal social democratic governments if it suited the designs of the right. In this new Germany of decrees, uniforms, and dissolutions, Hitler no longer needed to storm the state by force. He could wait while others discredited and dismantled it for him. By late summer 1932, Germany's political life resembled a building whose foundations had been quietly removed while the upper floors continued their routines out of habit. Franz von Papen sat in the Chancellery with almost no support in the Reichstag, governing by presidential decree and the borrowed prestige of Hindenburg's name. On the streets, the real powers growing were not the ministries but the mass parties with uniforms, the Nazis and the Communists. Between them, they controlled a near majority of seats. In that fractured landscape, Papen was less a leader than a placeholder. He clung to one hope. The July 31st election had made the NSDAP the largest party, but it had also saddled Hitler with responsibility. Papen believed he could exploit that. In early August, he met Hitler at the Chancellery and offered him a subordinate role, vice-chancellor in a cabinet still controlled by conservatives and the army. Hitler refused flatly. He wanted the chancellorship or nothing. Papen left the meeting simultaneously alarmed and reassured, alarmed by Hitler's intransigence, reassured that the president still considered the Bohemian corporal unfit for the top office. Kurt von Schleicher watched this dance with increasing impatience. Papen had been his creation, but the pupil was no longer taking guidance. Emboldened by his access to Hindenburg, Papen imagined he could outplay both Hitler and the general staff. Schleicher, whose own plans for a managed alliance with the Nazis required discipline and careful timing, saw instead a series of improvisations that risked handing Hitler exactly what he wanted. The political deadlock sharpened as the economy stagnated. Unemployment remained crushing, street violence escalated. Papen's overthrow of the Prussian government had impressed the right but alienated the left and center further. When the new Reichstag met on September 12, 1932, the result was predictable. At Hitler's initiative, the deputies passed yet another overwhelming vote of no confidence in the Papen cabinet. Papen responded with the only tool he seemed to know. He asked Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag again and call new elections for November 6. This time, the voters sent back a more complex message. The Nazis remained the largest party, but their share of the vote slipped from 37.3% in July to 33.1% in November. They lost nearly 2 million votes and 34 seats. The Communists gained. Many weary Germans, frightened by the violence of the SA and unconvinced by Hitler's refusal to join any coalition, began drifting back to smaller conservative or centrist parties. For perhaps the last time, the electoral trend suggested that the Nazi wave might have peaked. Papen read this as vindication. He believed that one more round of firmness would break Hitler's appeal and allow a purely presidential authoritarian regime to stabilize. He began to float ideas of using the army to impose martial law, dissolve parliament indefinitely, and rule without even the fig leaf of elections. Schleicher saw a different danger. The Reichswehr was small, 100,000 men by Versailles Treaty limits, and politically unreliable in a civil war against millions of Nazis and communists. Many officers shared Papen's contempt for the Republic but doubted the army's capacity to police a nationwide dictatorship on its own. The general had no intention of gambling the army's future on an adventure that might end in chaos. Quietly, he decided to remove his own creation. In late November, Schleicher went to Hindenburg and presented Papen's martial law fantasies as reckless and unrealistic. The Chancellor, he warned, was isolating the presidency, antagonizing all parties, and courting a conflict that the army could not win. Hindenburg, who prided himself on being the final arbiter, listened gravely. When Papen soon afterward pressed his own plan for an authoritarian coup, the president, armed with Schleicher's caution, refused. On December 1, 1932, Papen was effectively told that his services were no longer required. The next day, Hindenburg appointed Kurt von Schleicher Chancellor of Germany. For the first time since the Republic's birth, a serving general took the top civilian office. Schleicher entered the Chancellery with a different strategy from Papen's. Rather than rule solely by decree and noble camarilla, he hoped to build a new, cross-class coalition, the Korpsfront. He courted elements of the trade unions and moderate social democrats with promises of public works and an end to harsh austerity. At the same time, he tried to split the Nazi Party by reaching out to Gregor Strasser, the more socially radical rival to Hitler within the NSDAP leadership. It was a bold, intricate plan, and it failed quickly. Hitler moved ruthlessly to crush Strasser's influence, forcing his resignation and reaffirming his own control over the party. Trade union leaders, wary of the army's intentions and remembering the Preußenschlag, balked at trusting a general who still governed by emergency decree. Big industrialists and junker landowners grew suspicious of Schleicher's flirtation with organized labor, muttering that he was a social general. In less than 2 months, the Chancellor who had toppled Brüning and Papen found himself isolated on all sides. He had alienated the Nazis without defeating them, frightened conservatives without securing the left, and now confronted a president increasingly tired of experiments. Into that vacuum stepped a familiar figure eager for revenge, Franz von Papen, ready to make common cause with the very man he had once hoped to keep out of power, Adolf Hitler. In January 1933, the last act of the drama that had begun with Brüning's fall played out as a series of discreet visits to the Reich president by men who believed they could still control events. Kurt von Schleicher, now Chancellor, walked a narrowing path. His attempt to build a core front between unions and conservative elites alarmed almost everyone. The right whispered that he was flirting with socialism, the left doubted the sincerity of a general who governed by decree. Crucially, he failed to win Hitler. When Schleicher tried to lure away Gregor Strasser and the Nazi Party's trade union wing in December 1932, Hitler struck back with surgical ferocity. He forced Strasser's resignation from all party offices and made clear to Hindenburg that no deal could bypass him. The NSDAP might be broke and demoralized after electoral setbacks, but its internal discipline remained iron. By the turn of the year, Schleicher knew his government was crumbling. He asked Hindenburg for permission to dissolve the Reichstag yet again and to rule under a prolonged state of economic emergency. The president, increasingly wary of constitutional improvisations and under intense pressure from his own conservative entourage, hesitated. In that hesitation, Franz von Papen saw his opening. Humiliated by his dismissal in December, Papen was determined to return and to destroy Schleicher. In early January, he met secretly with Hitler at the house of banker Kurt von Schroeder in Cologne. The two men, who only months earlier had eyed each other with mutual contempt, now explored an alliance. Papen's offer was audacious. Hindenburg could be persuaded to appoint Hitler Chancellor, provided that conservatives filled key cabinet posts and Papen himself became Vice-Chancellor, with the president's ear. The real power, Papen assured skeptical allies, would remain in responsible hands. In a cabinet of national concentration, Hitler would be hemmed in by conservative ministers, by Hindenburg above, and by Papen at his side. The Nazis would provide mass support, the old elites would hold the reins. It was, in essence, the same illusion that had driven Schleicher's games with the NSDAP, that Hitler could be used without being obeyed. Throughout January, this intrigue unfolded in parallel with Schleicher's efforts to cling to office. The Chancellor warned Hindenburg that appointing Hitler would be disastrous, risking civil war or dictatorship. The president listened but felt increasingly boxed in. Schleicher could not command a majority, his coalition schemes had failed, the economy showed no dramatic improvement, and influential conservative advisers, Papen foremost among them, pressed the case that only a government including the Nazis could stabilize the nation. On January 28, 1933, Schleicher tendered his resignation after Hindenburg refused his request for emergency powers without parliamentary backing. Once again, the man who had orchestrated another's fall now found the presidential pen turned against him. 2 days later, on January 30th, Adolf Hitler walked up the steps of the Reich Chancellery as Germany's new chancellor. The cabinet he headed looked, on paper, like the constraining structure Papen had promised. Only 3 of 11 ministers were Nazis. Papen himself became vice-chancellor. Hindenburg's confidant Konstantin von Neurath took foreign affairs. Conservative heavyweights like Hugenberg of the DNVP joined the team. Outside, however, a different reality was already asserting itself. SA and SS columns marched through Berlin streets in exultant torchlight parades. Crowds cheered a man who only 10 months earlier had been barred from the presidency and whose private army Brüning had tried to outlaw. The chain from April to January was not simple, but it was continuous. Brüning's attempt to restrain Nazism by banning the SA and SS, and his broader policy of ruling by presidential decree while imposing crushing austerity, alienated both the masses and the conservative elites. Schleicher exploited that rift to convince Hindenburg that Brüning was a liability. Papen's cabinet of barons reversed the ban, dissolved the Reichstag, and toppled Prussia's democratic government, proving that the old right was willing to dismantle the republic to save its own dominance. Schleicher's own chancellorship then collapsed under the weight of his failed balancing act. At each step, the same pattern repeated. Men who despised parliamentary democracy sought to replace it with a controlled, authoritarian order while believing they could contain Adolf Hitler. Each of them helped destroy the remaining defenses of the Weimar state, until, by January 1933, the only figure capable of mobilizing millions for a new regime was Hitler himself. When Hindenburg, the aristocratic camarilla around him, and Papen finally handed the chancellorship to the Nazi leader, they did so in a Germany where the rule of law had been hollowed out by emergency decrees, where the largest state government had been overthrown, where streets belonged to paramilitaries, and where voters had been sent to the polls again and again until many had given up on the idea that ballots could decide anything. The fall of Chancellor Brüning in May 1932 did not make Hitler's rise inevitable, but it removed a damaged, constitutional dam and replaced it with a series of brittle, improvised barriers built by men who did not understand, or would not admit, how powerful the current had become. Less than 6 months after Brüning had tried to save the Republic by banning Nazi stormtroopers, those same brown shirts marched past the Reich Chancellery in triumph, their torches reflected in its windows, as Adolf Hitler took power through a door that conservative elites had unlocked for him.